My name is Amelia Powers Gardner, and I am the county clerk in Utah County, Utah. We are a county of about 700,000 citizens and about 330,000 active registered voters. I am actually the elections official who runs the election, so I'm going to be bringing in a dose of reality to the conversation to talk about actuals rather than theories. So I am a leader in the space of digital voting. Now, I want to caveat that by saying that I am a vote by mail county. We do early voting at the polls. We do election day voting at the polls. We mail every single one of our 330,000 active registered voters a ballot. We do signature verification at a high level. We are an identification state. So if you're showing up at the polls on election day, you require a picture ID. And I have embraced this concept of remote ballot marking devices because I like Audrey's stool that showed voter access and security. I believe that if we do not give voters access to a ballot, we are in essence putting a poll tax on them. I think that every person who has a right to vote needs to also have access to a ballot. And I have found through personal experience of myself and my staff, as well as from feedback from my citizens, that the current methods available just simply do not serve all of our citizens. And every time that we do not make it available for someone to vote, we are taking away their constitutional right to vote. So I've been really pushing for this space for certain demographics. So I want to talk about implementing new technology. So new technology coming, it should be adopted with a couple of things in mind. Number one, we need to compare it to what's actually happening. So I understand that Audrey was talking about overseas voters and it only takes 3 to 5 days to get your ballot back, and that's a really cute idea, but it just frankly doesn't happen. And so when we're looking at overseas and military voters, I have had story after story after story, complaint after complaint after complaint of our men and women serving in the military who don't get their ballot. They don't have access to a printer to print out a ballot, to fill it out, and they can't return that ballot. In fact, my chief deputy was serving in the military. He was in the Marine Corps serving in Fallujah, Iraq in 2008, never received his ballot. That same exact year, I was an expat living in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, just 8 hours north of the US border in a non-war zone, and I never received my ballot. Now, I had access to a printer. I could have printed off a ballot at work, filled it out, and sent it back. But Josh, living in Fallujah, Iraq, serving in the Marine Corps, did not have access to a printer. So we need to look at things rather than in theory. The most important thing is we need to look at things in reality. I think Susan Eustace pointed out very well that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of prosecuted cases where paper at the polls on election day was used to fraudulently swing an election. And election fraud has been prosecuted in paper at the polls on election day. So I want to look at any of these new technologies. Do I think any of them are absolutely safe, 100% secure? Absolutely not. But what I do as an election official is I'm comparing them to what we currently have. And what we currently have is a system that disenfranchises millions of voters. For example, if people with disabilities voted at the same rate as people without disabilities, we'd have 2.4 million more voters in this country every election. So this brings me into my next point, why we need to expand ballot access for people with disabilities, people with housing insecurity, or in the case of a natural disaster. In my county, on June 28th of 2020, we had a wildfire that evacuated one of our cities completely. And this happened 48 hours before the election. we tend to get about half of our ballots returned within the last 36 hours of the election. So half of the people that were going to vote in that primary election, their ballot was on their fridge, on their counter, on their kitchen table. They had not returned it yet. And when you're grabbing your children and your animals and your heirlooms and getting in your car and evacuating as quickly as you can, you don't think to stop and grab your ballot. Now, you say, well, maybe those people could just show up at the polls and vote, but we are a paper at the polls jurisdiction. And you can't just go down to Kinko's and buy paper or Staples and buy paper for ballots, because it's a security feature that our scanners will only scan ballot paper. And that ballot paper comes from a manufacturer that only sells that paper to us or our print vendors. I literally did not have enough paper to print ballots on to allow the people that were evacuated from their homes in the wildfire to vote. Thank goodness they were able to return to their homes about 4 hours before the polls opened, and people were able to go home. Those who wanted to vote could get their ballot, cast their vote, put it in a drop box. But had we not had that option, I would have needed another way to help those people vote. Otherwise, I am taking away their right to vote. So I understand that there are issues and that there are risks, and I'm not advocating for every single person to vote remotely. I still will mail every one of my 330 active registered voters a ballot. I will still continue to verify those signatures and to keep those paper ballots. I will still have early voting locations available for my citizens, and I will still have polling locations on election day. But what I, as an election official, need is, number one, I need to expand access to people with housing insecurity, people at lower areas of the socioeconomic ladder, people who live rurally, those with disabilities, those living overseas, or in the case of a natural disaster or an emergency. We've got to have a way for people to vote. Otherwise, we are issuing them essentially a poll tax and creating a barrier for them to vote. I think that's unconstitutional. But what I really need is I need a set of standards for secure remote voting that I can use to judge mobile voting options against. These standards can have caveats. These standards can say for those with disabilities, those overseas, those quarantined because they had a positive COVID test, or in the case of a natural disaster. But in the case that we need the ability to bring somebody a ballot, I've got to have a set of standards. I personally prefer blockchain because it gives me the ability to do some audits. Now, can I audit that completely end to end? No, because of a secret ballot. That is something that people have a right to, and I fully support that. But what the blockchain does is when I print off ballots from people who used remote voting, it gives me the ability to take that paper ballot that I just printed, and I can have a hash on that paper ballot, and I can check that hash against a block on the blockchain, and I can say whether or not the paper ballot that I've printed, that I'm going to put through my scanners with all of my other ballots, I can see if it matches that blockchain record. Now,
Amelia, I got to give you a 1 minute warning.
That's fine. So the last thing I do want to say is the last speaker that talked about using a blockchain to secure the voter registration system, it is a fantastic idea. I have actually been talking about that for a year, and I still have not seen any company come forward with that as a solution. I think, by the way, that is the perfect example for blockchains and voting. So thank you for bringing that up. That is securing the voter registration database in a blockchain so that it cannot be tampered with. Can you imagine if someone tampered with that database and I sent 330,000 ballots to the wrong addresses because someone tampered with that database? So I think that's the perfect idea for blockchain. In the meantime, I want to be able to use blockchain to audit accessible voting, because accessible voting needs to be a reality.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amelia. And I failed to mention that Amelia is a winner of the 2020 GBA Leadership Award, which was handed out in the United States Capitol in January 2020. So
thank you.